So my name is Stu Marvel, and I am a PhD candidate from Osgoode Hall Law School in Toronto, which is in Canada, for your non-Canadian viewers. I'm here for a year as visiting scholar. Basically, I'm finishing my PhD right now, so I've done all my research and my coursework. I'm just trying to write my thesis and get that finished. I've been teaching courses up at Osgoode in Canada, and so Professor Feynman invited me to come down and participate as a scholar here, teach a course in the winter semester, and basically just participate in the vibrant culture that is the Feminist Legal Theory Project and the Vulnerability and Human Condition Initiative. Well, in fact, I think my path has been fairly non-traditional in terms of an academic trajectory. I didn't really go to school until about 5 or 6 years ago. I left in 1999 for South Korea from Canada to teach skiing originally. I ended up working at a newspaper for about 3 years and then was hired for the Korean Commission for UNESCO. And I worked for UNESCO for another 2.5 years in Seoul. So through that, I really got a good sense of what international development practice would look like, ways that I might be able to contribute within the UN system, but also just thinking about sort of global justice and gender justice. So when I left Seoul, I moved to England and I did a master's degree in gender analysis for international development over there. Came back to Canada, was hired by CEDA, which is the Canadian International Development Agency, and I went to West Africa and I worked for a year in the Gambia as a gender advisor to the Ministry for Women. Really interesting work, but very much sort of on the ground. We did quantitative analysis. We took a sort of a gender snapshot of what was going on in the country at that time for women and girls. And I just learned so much of how to contribute to international systems of justice. But it really got me thinking about what justice looked like. So I decided I wanted to come back and do a master's in law in Canada. So I returned to Vancouver, which is where I'm from, and I spent the summer volunteering at a women's shelter downtown, and was confronted for the first time with the racialized gendered poverty that exists in Canada in a way that I hadn't had to before, because I've been living overseas since '99. So I was working with a lot of young Aboriginal women that were on this sort of rough circuit from reserve to living in this downtown east side, this urban concentration of poverty in Vancouver. So I shifted my project to look at Aboriginal rights and Aboriginal justice in Canada. So that was my LLM. So I finished that at Osgoode Hall in Toronto, and I've since moved on to doing the PhD there. So a law degree in Canada is the same as it is in the States, that we do a bachelor's first, then you do your JD, and then you move on. But I skipped a little bit of that because I was doing sort of professional work overseas. Well, Professor Feynman has been a big influence for many years for me. I was the chair of our Graduate Law Student Association 2 years ago at Osgoode, and I organized all the keynote speakers for that conference. So we ended up having Janet Halley and Francisco Valdez come to speak, but before they agreed, I'd asked Martha Feynman if she would like to come and be our keynote, so she was unfortunately too busy. But she's really been an inspirational figure to me for a long time as a legal scholar and just as a feminist, really. So when I was a visiting scholar at the Center for Law, Gender, and Sexuality at Kent University in January of this year, and I met some folks over there that had come here and spoke really highly of the program and really highly of Professor Feynman, of course, and it seemed like a possibility. So I sent her an email, and that day she was welcoming me down, and it was really generous, and I'm super excited to be here. Well, it really ties into my interest in sort of the family law and notions of the family more broadly. As I mentioned, I did an LLM in Aboriginal rights, and that looked at sort of the intergenerational transfer of what's called Indian status under the Canada's Indian Act. It looked at how, because we have a particular Western notion of the family, that really disenfranchises people that fall outside of that very narrow category. So in this case, it was Aboriginal women that were either single or didn't want to indicate who the father was on the birth certificate, and so they were being disenfranchised in terms of rights and benefits for their children, because their children were being pushed out of Indian status because the state only recognized a dyadic male-female model as being appropriate, or as being something that would be deserving of rights and benefits going forward. So that really got me thinking about what the family looks like and how all kinds of folks that fall outside of that catchment are being really left out in the cold. So for my doctoral work, I've moved into thinking about what the natural family looks like in terms of assisted reproduction, and how Canada's laws around that really don't allow space for gays and lesbians and transgendered folks to be able to make claims upon that state in order to get access to reproductive technologies and be able to create their families in the ways that they want to. terms of the legal questions, I think that's actually really interesting right now in Canada. In 2004, we had an act called the Assisted Human Reproduction Act, was given royal assent, so sort of called into being, and almost immediately was challenged by the Quebec government, which is one of our provinces, as being unconstitutional, and that it overstepped the federal government's powers by going into provincial issues of health law, because health is something that's mandated on a provincial level. So it took from 2006, I think is when this challenge was launched, up until 2010, just December of last year, for this to work its way through the court system and finally get up to the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court decided in this very controversial and very divided ruling of December of last year that this AHRA, this federal act, needed to be kind of cut in two. So they kept all of the research, so things to do with embryo manipulation or human-animal hybrids, all kinds of laboratory work, still stay as mandated on a under the federal power, but everything else has been shifted to the provinces. So that means every province now has to develop its own regulations around AHR, almost starting from scratch again. This is after so many years of trying to get this regulation through the courts, and through the justice system. So basically, there's a legislative vacuum right now in the province that I'm from, and in every province in Canada, because we don't really have anything, any legal structure in place right now, because it's all been shifted around. So this means that all the fertility clinics are actually self-regulating themselves. So they all have these internal policies that are basically around liability and trying to make sure that they cover themselves and don't get sued by their clients. So I'm really interested in making sure that our research is able to inject queer voices and queer perspectives into what's happening as this legislative review and legislative development happens, because it's a very timely sort of moment to make this kinds of interjections, and I think that's, for me, it's a very exciting part of being involved from a legal perspective right now. Well, the law itself was first drafted as a bill in 1989. So it really came into being during this late 80s fear around biotechnology and what that was going to look like. The newspapers were full of stories about human-animal hybrids, about stem cell research, and about all the terror of sort of tinkering with the stuff of life itself. So I think that really fed into some of the hysteria around the way these laws have been drafted. So they're very repressive, I think, in terms of what access they allow Canadians to clinical procedures. And that's what this SCC Supreme Court ruling was trying to do, was to separate the laboratory from the clinical. So they're saying, okay, we need to be vigilant about what happens in laboratories, fair enough, but people have reproductive needs, and they need to be able to access clinics and have their needs be met. So that was an attempt with this most recent ruling to try to separate some of that, the hysteria that went into the initial bill. But I would not in any way say that queer perspectives were being recognized as part of that, because of commercial surrogacy still being illegal. So this means that gay men that are unable to adopt for whatever reason, they are looking for surrogates to be able to have children for them. In many states in the US, this can be a commercial transaction, a woman can be paid for this, and the child is born and raised by the parents, the intended parents, who in this case would be a gay couple. But in Canada, that kind of commercial transaction is criminalized. So you can spend up to 10 years in jail and get a fine of $500,000 if you're seen to be engaging in the criminal action of commercial surrogacy. So it means that it's happening, but it's all gone underground. So folks are going online, on the Craigslist forums, on surrogacy forums, and doing these sketchy double dealings, which doesn't, I think, protect the woman or protect the intended parents. It makes for a lot of vulnerability across the board. And that's something that the original law and even this most recent Supreme Court decision isn't really taking into account, because they're using a model of medical infertility that really frames only heterosexual experience, right? So it's like a wounded fertility, broken fertility, while what queer folks are experiencing is a social infertility, right? So we never expected to have reproductive encounters from our sexual lives, but we all still want a parent, right? So how does the medical system need to be shifted, and that model need to be shifted in order to take account of queer experience is really what I'm concerned with, and trying to think outside of this really narrow version of medical infertility. Well, because this notion of nature really underscores a lot of what I'm trying to think about when I'm trying to pull apart when we're talking about access to reproductive justice. Someone like Donna Haraway has been really influential for trying to to break apart these nodes. Feminist science studies is also really exciting to me. There's a lot of people that are writing some really powerful work about embryos and about the thresholds of life. I'll mention Canadian scholars here because I would like to support my fellow country women's. Lorna Weir was also at York University, writes some really interesting stuff about threshold of life. Mariana Valverde, who is a sort of Foucauldian criminologist at the University of Toronto, she writes some really interesting work. Roxana Kadiak is a real inspiration. She writes a lot about reproductive work and reproductive health. And in fact, she was supervised by Martha Feynman for her doctoral studies. So it's a nice kind of intergenerational community here that we managed to wind from Canada to the States. And then there's women like Brenda Cosman, who's at the University of Toronto. She writes about sexual citizenship and what it is to sort of have a claim to legitimacy in the state, which I think is really interesting, talking about queer families and from a queer perspective. So yeah, so there's lots that inspires me, but nothing that is written particularly about this angle that I've seen. So I think there's room not only in terms of legislative opportunities for us getting new bills and laws drafted, but also from a theoretical perspective to try to shift this medical infertility model and look at something that I'm calling reproductive exceptionalism, to try to get outside of this idea that queers are somehow an exceptional case, that it's a whole new terrain and new framework. We really need to develop new vocabularies, new language, I think, to think about it.
Yeah.
So I'm now in the 4th year of my PhD. So I began this project 4 years ago. When I first drafted this research project, I knew that I had to go and actually do interviews. I wanted to talk to people. I wanted to see what's actually happening in the ground, which is not really that common in law, to be honest. I mean, I'm coming much more as a sort of a legal anthropologist or sociologist, I think, to the study, because it's been hard to find not just the funding at Osgoode, but just models for how I could approach this and do this kind of empirical work. So I drafted my study, but 2 months later saw circulating through these sort of online listservs this Creating Our Families project that had been this nationally funded health research project that was being done by local queer advocacy organizations and the local sort of, it's called the Center for Addiction and Mental Health, but they have like a researching LGBTQ health wing as part of that. And they basically were doing exactly what I was doing, but they lacked a legal component. So I called them up and I said, hey guys, my name's Stu, I'm from Osgoode, and I'm doing this thing that is so much in alignment with you. What do you think about us somehow collaborating? So we had these meetings, and they invited me to join as a co-investigator in the project. So I ended up doing half the interviews. My co-investigator, who was hired by them, did the other half. And we're doing the analysis now together, so this collaborative project, which has been really exciting to work with people we've got health practitioners, there's doctors, there's society, or like social activists and organizers. There are psychologists and community counselors. There's other kinds of clinicians. I don't know. It's really exciting. So I feel very lucky to be part of this very robust collective doing this work together. Well, for the interviews themselves, we decided to do semi-structured interviews. We put out this call for participants across the province, and we had 117 responses, which is really astonishing for somebody looking at a very particular note of what queer health looks like. We asked for LGBTQ identified people who had either thought about using AHR, AHR being a shorthand for assisted human reproduction, thought about using AHR from January 2007, and either had used it and had been successful, had used it and failed, or had tried and were unable to access it for whatever reason. So we wanted to just kind of get the whole spectrum of experience in terms of both really positive outcomes and also negative outcomes, and understand what's going on in that healthcare system at that clinical level when folks are walking into these fertility clinics. What's going on? How are they being treated as queer folks? Are their experiences being understood? Is there like a cultural competency on the part of these clinicians? And are they getting their healthcare needs met, ultimately? So we did these really amazing interviews. They were about between an hour and a half each, with 42 to 45 families. So we've just are finishing the last of them now, and we're getting them all transcribed. And I'm basically using two different methodological approaches to analyze this. The first one is kind of a quick and dirty, like we just need to get in there, get some results, and get that disseminated to the important institutions, so like the legislators, to the different colleges of physicians and doctors in Canada, and to fertility clinics themselves, so they can understand actually what's going on and if they're adequately meeting the needs of their clients, or their queer clients in particular. And the second one is what I'm actually applying for postdoc funding right now for, is to be able to have a much sort of more complex and more grounded research methodology in which it's a more iterative process. You go in and you allow the data to sort of develop cross themes across notions and platforms and topics. So I'm hoping to be able to write a much longer sustained critical ethnography of all these interviews that we've done. That's going to be a book-length project. So that's going to I have to put that on hold for about a year until I can just get my thesis done and write this series of articles that I'm planning to, which are going to address very specific sort of legal issues, medical issues, and clinical issues, and more cut and dried. Well, as I said, there's sort of two distinct trajectories in terms of what I want this research to do. So this first one is, I mean, I'm not the only one that's being involved, of course, in the production of results from the outcome of this project. So I'm doing more of the legal angle, right? So I'm writing articles right now for legal journals and that are specifically aimed for a legal audience, and that I hope will have the impact of influencing not only legislators and lawmakers, but also legal scholars and other people working on similar issues in Canada, just so they can understand this paradigm shift that needs to happen in terms of the way we think about these medical models, right? So that's one angle. But my partners are doing what's called Forum Theatre right now. So they've got another grant to do this knowledge transmission project, in which they are going to be doing an interactive theatre project where they've all been trained now to basically reenact what goes on in these clinics. So they're going to take a worst case scenario and play that out among themselves, right? And then a second or third folk will come up and stop the theatre play, insert themselves into that drama, and then play it out in a different way, right? So it's a chance to actually experientially get in there and try to basically just create different outcomes from really negative, really horrible play that you've seen the first time. Yeah. They're working on, I think, 3 or 4 different scripts. One of them is aimed to the sort of a primary stakeholder audience, which is the LGBT community themselves, right? So it's like, here's what's going on, here's ways that you, as someone who might be accessing these kinds of clinical resources, will know how to adapt better and know how to engage better with these doctors and these nurses you'll be meeting, right? So they're touring around to different LGBTQ communities, but they're also going to the clinics themselves, right? So that so clearly there's different scripts that are going to be involved in terms of for the target audience. But the intention is to, again, bring this really experiential mode of knowledge transmission. So we're going to have reports, and then we've already given a report to the Canadian Fertility and Andrology Society, and we're using those traditional fora as well. But we thought that Forum Theatre was a really great way to be able to engage people because it's a real heartstring issue as well, right? Like it is a really visceral notion. You're talking about families and babies, and it's very effective emotionally. So to use this kind of engagement, I think, in a Forum Theatre is a really novel and exciting way to be able to get folks on board, get them to experience different ways of being able to ensure that people's needs are being met. The idea of nature itself is a really complex and often politically charged idea, right? I mean, you can see in the States where people are talking about how it ain't natural that gays and lesbians should have, you know, same-sex marriage or relationships of any kind at all, apparently, right? So nature can be used as a very powerful tool, an ideological tool on both sides, I think, to be able to, or all sides, to be able to advance a political claim. So I'm interested in really problematizing what that means, right? So we say, but it's natural and our ancestors did it. Like evolutionary biology is a really, like it's a very interesting approach, but I think it's one that really needs to be taken apart at every turn. So that's something that is very much part of what I hope that my research will do. And just letting people understand that there's different models and different ways of being, right? And that's ultimately the heart of my project, you know, is that we don't have one way of making families. There's not one way of having a nature, or whatever nature might even refer to. So I think that there's a lot of effective capital to be held when we talk about children and talk about family making, and everyone has an investment in a family in some way, because we all presumably have a parent somewhere. And just ways to ensure that those are not used as ideological levers to prevent other folks from making the families that they choose and the families that they want to create. So it's yeah, I'm still really trying to pick this apart. I think it's a really interesting idea of how nature operates as a rhetorical and as a political tool. Well, I must say that I am so excited about being down here and being part of the VHC in this way. And I think this new paradigm shift that we see occurring with thinking about relations of care and dependence as vulnerability and as resilience and as the sort of the cluster of concepts around this and what the VHC is founded upon. I think the excitement of this shift really attests to the global character of the program itself. You know, we've got scholars from China here, women from the Constitutional Court of South Korea. We've got a Norwegian scholar coming next semester, or sorry, next month. Mm-hmm. I'm here as a Canadian. You know, it's clear that people want to be involved in this, and everyone's work can be engaged and excited in different facets by it. So for me, I'm particularly interested in moving outside of an identitarian box, right? Because, I mean, of course, I'm talking about LGBTQ people and queer folks, but queer studies itself has been queer notions of embodiment themselves. Have been very frustrated by the identity categories that are themselves quite static, right? And it's hard to talk across and talk for coalitional justice or transversal justice when you're in this one little narrow frame. Particularly when that one narrow frame usually means white middle class men, really. So it's sort of it's been a lot of talk about how queer movements have been co-opted or what they stand for, or whatever. But what's exciting about for me with vulnerability is how we can get away from all that, and we can actually step a bit apart from these identity categories and think about what care looks like across a broader frame. You know, what is compassion? What are these relationships of care? And for me, of care and commerce, because I'm also interested in this commercial surrogacy and these commercial aspects. So how can we rethink some of these notions of vulnerability? Is it only the women that are providing this commercial surrogacy service? Is there vulnerability in the part of these intended parents? You know, how is the system failing in all these different ways when we think about reproductive justice? And how can we use these new notions, which offer, I think, really rich and really exciting theoretical interventions to talk about it. So yeah, vulnerability is really exciting for me. It's such an exciting community of scholars and intergenerational too. You know, you've got mentors and established faculty. You've got undergrads and these young people that just want to be involved because they see something so exciting happening. So it's a very lively intellectual ferment, and I'm really glad to be here.